Okay, tonight we're going to wrap the study up. We're going to kind of look quickly at several different chapters, all basically dealing with difficult or special cases, areas where this approach to decision making gets some pushback. And I'm going to take a little different approach tonight. Be more in the way of personal testimony, I think. If you haven't read the book, you certainly have a copy. You can read it at some length. But several of the areas, a couple in particular, get a lot of resistance from people when you apply his approach to decision making rigorously. And I will give Mr. Friesen points for consistency, because he is. He's pretty loath to make exceptions to his system. I guess I'm just not as thoroughgoingly consistent as he is. And I can't really give you a good compelling reason for my unwillingness to be consistent other than personal experience, maybe just personal prejudice. But he starts out with a chapter on marriage, then he deals with call to ministry, to selecting vocations and schools and all of those kinds of things, the matter of Christian giving, and then he talks about how you deal with other believers when you're at odds with them. I guess particularly when you're at odds with how you go about decision making. And I would encourage you, if you've got questions, comments, stories, observations on any of these, jump right in. Don't wait for me to pause, just stop me. The first one he talks about is marriage. And this is one of those things where it is commonly asserted that there's one Mr. Right or Miss Right for you, one perfect mate, and if you don't find that perfect mate, then you're doomed for grief. Let me just start by asking, do you believe that's true? Is there only one person on this planet that God has specially chosen for you, or was there one of many possibilities that might well have worked out just as well had circumstances been different? And this will not be held against you in your relationship with your mate. If you want to keep it in the circle, we can do that. Everybody but Joyce and I, we're both here. What do you think, Mark?
I don't think that there's just one person. And I don't think about it so much in my regard, but for my kids, for Josh, my prayer's been that someone out there God is preparing, maybe several someones, I don't think that, that there's makes much sense that there would be a single and only one person that would be suitable and and a good mate. So.
Well, if I can put you on the spot, you seem to do a pretty good job in your selection process. How did you manage that?
Well, not the way I was telling Joyce, I didn't go into the analysis that he did.
Well, with your scientific training, I thought you might have been real systematic.
Well, met here, so I started off right. So. But just basically,
Kind of fell in together.
Certainly looking, but yeah, it just.
Well, you actually made a very important point right up front. You said you met here. God does have some specific guidance on this business of finding a mate. And the one that is actually about the only specific instruction, and it depends on how you interpret the passage, is that you marry a believer. And that is inferred from the passage that says, don't be unequally yoked. Now, that doesn't specifically say marriage. So that is an interpretation of the passage. We are inferring marriage. It could also actually apply, and I believe does apply, to a lot of other relationships. For a Christian, if you're wanting to go into business with a partner, I'm not talking about a big corporation with lots and lots, I'm talking about an equal partnership, say a grocery store or whatever, where two people have to work side by side in running a business. If one of you is a Christian and the other is not, unless that unbeliever happens to hold on to a lot of Christian values, even though he or she is not a Christian, you're in for real problems. Every bit as bad as a Christian married to an unbeliever. Because you're having to make decisions together and you're approaching it from two very different value systems. So I think Paul's instruction on this point does apply to marriage, but I think it applies to a lot of other things as well. And I can give you multiple heartbreaking accounts of Christians who ignored that and became very much unequally yoked. Some of them from within my own family. So it's serious business. And but really, the Bible doesn't give a lot of instruction beyond that. And it's important at this point for us to remember that how we regard this whole business of selecting a mate and getting married, what we think of as normal for that is actually a modern novelty when you look at the total history of humanity and even specifically of Christianity. It wasn't that long ago that most marriages, even Christian marriages, were arranged. That's still the case in many parts of the world. And for us, that's just almost inconceivable. But that was the norm for most of history. And so when we look at what the Bible's saying about selecting a mate, there was an assumption on the part of most of Paul's readers that the selecting process was being done by the parents. And that's kind of hard to get your head around in our perspective. This idea of romantic love, finding somebody, falling in love, and going through courtship and getting married, again, from the historical standpoint, is a kind of a modern innovation. And we have to keep that in mind when we start talking about what does the Bible say about marriage in general and about Christian marriage in particular. Does God have one person in mind for you to marry? I think the answer is yes. I think that comes under his sovereignty. I think in his sovereignty, obviously he knows what's going to happen. He can limit options. He can bring people together in unexpected ways. If you had asked me who I was going to marry back when I was first called into the ministry at the age of 15, I would probably have said something assuming that it was going to be some girl that I'd gone to school with in High Ridge, Missouri, where I'd spent most of my childhood. But within 2 years of my call to the ministry, I was living 80 miles away in the little town of Caledonia, where I started my sophomore year of high school seated next to Joyce Brooks in homeroom. God arranged things so that we were literally thrown side by side first thing in the morning for that whole sophomore year of high school. Now, from what was told to me after the fact, I was regarded as a weirdo because I carried a Bible to study hall. So I didn't make much points with young Miss Brooks for a long time, but halfway through our senior year, she finally got dumped by the deadbeat that she was dating. And I saw an opportunity to score quickly and to get in there while her heart was broken and make my move. Get them on the rebound, I believe is what they call that. And so during Christmas break, I asked her out on our first date. And by the end of our senior year, we were an item at Valley High School. Now, I have to admit, I didn't do a lot of praying about asking Joyce out on a date. I did years earlier. When I was first called into the ministry, I did pray that God would choose the right woman for me, that He would help me marry someone who would be a good choice for me going into the ministry. And in a matter of full disclosure, on our first date, I made it quite emphatic that I was going to be a preacher, which I learned after the fact she didn't believe. Thought I was going to be a lead miner like her daddy. Because everybody around there, most of the boys either end up in the lead mines or in the TIF mill. So I was kind of outside the norm on that point. So there was prayer in the process on my part. Never asked Joyce if she prayed about who she was going to marry before she met me. Did you? No. Just purely following your
Just
emotions.
prayed it wouldn't be that guy
In Homer.
as a sophomore.
The guy that carried the Bible, but protect me from him. So there was prayer involved. There was truth-telling involved. There was an expectation of finding a Christian. I didn't find a Baptist. I turned her into one. She was a Methodist when we met. But she was at least willing to become a Baptist in name, if not in her heart of hearts, for a long time.
We still love you, Joyce.
And I would argue that there was some wisdom involved. Because I looked for somebody that I thought would be a good wife, not just a good time. And that's not how everybody approaches dating. I wanted somebody that, I could build a life around. Because if for no other reason, from just pure survival standpoint, particularly at that time in life, there wasn't much of a future for Baptist ministers who'd been through a divorce. So I need somebody that was going to stay with me. And I looked at the home she came from. And I looked at her mother, who was as Methodist as you can get, but who was a marvelous, godly woman. And I thought, if she's anything like her mom, she's a keeper. So I didn't really think through this with the rigors that Dr. Friesen might recommend, but I wasn't going just on blind emotion either. And we didn't rush into it, but we didn't delay indefinitely either. And we tested the relationship in a rather pragmatic way. I went off to college, and she was staying there in Missouri, and so for 9 months, we were about 900 miles apart, sort of informally engaged and agreeing not to date anybody else. And that gave both of us the opportunity to decide, is this worth the wait? And we decided it was. We also decided we weren't going to go through another winter like that. And we got married really young, which gave us a real world test of our relationship. Because we were not only newly married, and Joyce a newly baptized Baptist, but within 3 months she was the pastor's wife, and was informed that they assumed that she would be the president of the WMU, and she didn't know what the letter stood for. I don't know if there is another woman out there on this planet who would have been just as good a wife as Joyce has been. But if she's out there, I haven't met her yet. And frankly, I haven't been looking. So I don't know if I completely agree with Gary Friesen on this or not. I think there is a lot more room for wisdom in the process than an awful lot of people are willing to bring to bear. I think a lot of people make decisions about marriage for a host of lousy reasons, and they suffer the consequences, and sometimes their kids suffer the consequences. There certainly ought to be more involved than just an emotional froth, and that's all that's involved in too many relationships. The Bible doesn't give us any help in how you find the perfect mate, other than you start with finding someone who shares your most important beliefs, and then apply wisdom in the process and prayerfully look for somebody that you believe you can build your life with. And I think if you do that much, you can leave the picking out the exact right person to God and His sovereignty. I thought it worked. Joyce, you got a rebuttal? Any other comments or questions on this? Okay. When we get to the area of vocation in general and ministry vocation in particular, we get into the point, particularly when we talk about call to ministry, call to missions, where I would predict Dr. Friesen is going to get the most pushback. When I was ordained into the ministry, one of the questions that the Ordination Council asked me was to describe my call to preach. When I first came before my home church of Fellowship Baptist Church in High Ridge, Missouri, at the ripe old age of 14, what I said to my congregation was, God has called me to preach. It was a reaffirmation of a call I had actually initially felt at the age of 12, when during a week at an RA's camp, in a miserable little old Baptist camp called Bates Creek Camp in Washington County, Missouri. Our camp building was literally a converted chicken coop. I give you an idea of the standards of that camp. But during that week, God stirred my heart in ways that I'd never been stirred before, and I went forward in a camp chapel service convinced that God had called me. Well, I initially thought God had called me to be an evangelist. I don't know why I said that, because I've never really had any sense since then specifically of a call as an evangelist, but rather as a call to a pastor, to a missionary. But that was the call, and I delayed following through with it for a variety of reasons, mostly because I didn't want to be a preacher. At the age of 12, I wanted to be a forest ranger. Preachers were guys that wore suits all day, and I hated suits. I mean, nothing real profound here. It was pretty simple. But again, I was 12. And I wasn't interested. My dad was an electrician. My grandfathers were farmers, and there were no preachers in my family. This is not. And I've known guys who ended up going into pastoral ministry because their dad was a preacher. There were women at Golden Gate Seminary who were enrolled in seminary because they wanted to marry a preacher. I think what they really had was a call to preach, and the only avenue available to them was to marry somebody because there were no women Baptist preachers in those days. And so in their frustration, that was the closest they could get. And, all I can say is God help the guy who married the woman who was called to preach, and he's the preacher. But there were some of them out there. I didn't hear a voice from heaven. I didn't have a dream. I had the very kind of thing that Dr. Friesen kind of puts down. I just had a very strong sense of call. It was pretty compelling because it persuaded me to do something that I didn't want to do. Now, I know guys who have had very effective pastoral ministries who never had that kind of strong sense of call, but who rather had a temperament, a set of skills and gifts and inclinations that well suited them for pastoral work. There are some aspects of pastoral work that, frankly, my temperament is not well suited for. There's some things that I have to do, and I'm not going to give you the list, that, if I were just on my own, it's not stuff I would normally do. But I do it because it's part of my responsibility. And so I don't discount the possibility that someone can go into ministry and receive God's blessing and be effective without that special sense of call that shaped my ministry. So at that point, I guess I would agree with Friesen that it's not necessary for everybody. It was just necessary for me. Because I don't think there's any way in the world I would have gone down this path had it not been for that sense of call. If for no other reason than the fact that I was absolutely terrified of public speaking. To the point of being a crying, quivering mass just reading a book report in the 5th grade. I mean, I'm talking about the closest thing to a phobia that I've ever had. It absolutely left me shaking, scared. And within a very short time when I started preaching, that fear left. And I believe it's a spiritual gift. As I've said to some of you before, one of the reasons is if you take me out of a ministry setting and put me in a PTA meeting or something, and I need to stand up and say something, because I'm an experienced, trained public speaker, I can pull it off. But in those contexts, I get the butterflies that I haven't felt in the pulpit since I was a teenager. Because I'm not working in my spiritual gift when I'm talking to the PTA. The idea of calling into a radio call-in show, and even on a phone, talking on the air would scare me to death. Could I do it? I'm sure I could pull it off. Would I be nervous? I would be very nervous. But I could stand, and I have no doubt I could stand and preach before thousands, and it wouldn't bother me any more than it does to talk to you here. Because I'm operating in the power of the Spirit's gift at that point. So just based again on my own personal experience and the experience of others I've talked to, I have to say that there is such a thing as a call to ministry that is somewhere between a simple rational decision and an angelic messenger, because that's where I'm at. Can I prove it? No. Can I even make a defense of it apart from my own experience? Not really. But I choose to believe it. And so at that point, I guess I'm just inconsistent with the book, and I sleep just fine with that. Questions or comments? I would say one other thing, and one other reason why I believe that what I experienced was a divine call. There was a time or two in my ministry when had it not been for that anchor, that sense that God had called me to this work, I'd have gone and done something else. That's the only thing that sustained me a time or two. I had plenty of reasons to find no way to make a living.
Man, I haven't read the book. I don't have a copy of the book, but would you tell us what his position is that differs from yours on that?
His whole position on decision making is in a nutshell, our responsibility is to make wise choices. If we're operating inside an area that is within God's moral will, so we're not doing something that the Bible says is wrong, or we're not failing to do something the Bible says to do, that inside that area of God's moral will is freedom to choose. And I think on 99% of the cases, that's exactly right. The only exception being a case of special revelation. If God sends an angel, or you have a divinely inspired dream, or you hear God's voice, which has never been the norm at any age, even in biblical times. And even for those like Moses who experienced that, it wasn't the norm for them. It was exceptional even for Moses. And he probably experienced it more than anybody other than Jesus. You know, most of the decisions Moses made were not by God speaking to him. It was just using good sense and wisdom. And most of what the Bible talks about in books like Proverbs is teaching wisdom. And so to be absolutely thoroughgoing according to Friesen's model, unless God does give you a supernatural call, then making a wise choice is really where it comes down. You know, do I have the gifts? Do I have the temperament? Do I have the background? Do I have the education? Am I willing to live with a lower cost of living or standard of living? You know, the other things that come with the job. What he does not accept as biblically valid are the kinds of things that most of us grew up describing as God's leadership, which are feelings, you know, in a sense of open doors, closed doors, a sense of the Spirit's inclination, things that are by definition totally subjective. And he rightly points out you can't find a single example in Scripture of God leading that way. You know, when God is directly telling somebody, there's no ambiguity about it. Nobody ever had a visit from an angel and wondered, well, was that an angel or was that the pizza I ate last night? You know, it's quite clear. You know, God doesn't stutter. And so, and like I said, in the vast majority of cases, I have no problem with that. In this one, from my own experience, what I had doesn't qualify as having the clarity of God speaking in an audible voice, but it's about as close as I've ever been.
We've been studying the book of Acts, and to come out of a study of the book of Acts is a little hard to face that attitude. I mean, the book of Acts sounds like it's a very much of the establishment of the early church in that part of the world was precisely directed by the Spirit of God.
And the author doesn't dispute that. But what he says is what what we encounter in places like the Book of Acts was special revelation. It was direct revelation from God. When when Paul had the Macedonian call, it wasn't a case of Paul saying, I got this feeling that the Spirit is leading me to go to Macedonia. He had an unmistakable, vivid, supernatural dream. And what Friesen says is, what we see in those kind of places in the New Testament is clearly God's special direction, but it is not what we pass off as the leading of the Spirit in much of our conversation. It's a whole lot clearer, a whole lot more vivid, a whole lot more direct. And I think that in many, many cases he's right. And I can think of times when I followed one of those feelings, thinking it was the Holy Spirit, and based on how that all worked out on several cases, I had to afterwards say, I think that was me. My intentions were fine. I wasn't trying to fool anyone, including myself, but I think I was misinterpreting my own instincts in some of those cases. When you move beyond call to vocational ministry to the specific business of call to missions, this is another one of those points where you're going to get some really strong pushback among some people. What I grew up hearing and believing was, even if I can describe a call to preach, that's not enough to become a career foreign missionary. That I needed a second call to missions. Ideally to a specific mission field, but at least to the whole challenge of vocational missions overseas. And I never had that call. I prayed on numerous occasions indicating to God I was willing, but and asking him for some specific direction if that's what he wanted me to do, and equally important, that he would lead Joyce that way. And she never had any sense of call to overseas missions at all. Now, according to the words of the guy going under the pseudonym of Nick Ripken, we're just placing extra avenues of escape to ignore following the Great Commission by that kind of thinking. That, we've got our marching orders, go into all the world and preach the gospel and make disciples. And so unless we are providentially hindered, we don't need a second commission, we just need to be obedient. At the same time, this same man, his call to ministry was a audible voice in the back part of an empty warehouse on more than one occasion. And he wasn't given to kind of charismatic kinds of experiences. At first he thought somebody was playing games with him. It was that audible a voice. Once again, I'm not sure what I believe. From a wisdom standpoint, there were many aspects of my background and training and skill set that would have well suited me to international missions, with one glaring exception: an absolute mulish inability to learn foreign languages. Every attempt I've ever made to learn, whether it was Latin or Greek or Hebrew, has been an exercise in pain. I'm sure that dumped into a culture where I had to learn the language or go hungry, I would have managed to communicate, me, hungry, eat. I'm not sure I'd ever would have gotten much better than that. But that's certainly one enormous red mark saying, you really need to find another line of work than foreign missions. Now, I know there are places overseas where you can work in English, but, for me to be pastoring a English language church in Germany, basically meant I'd be pastoring a church for service personnel, and other people who, non-natives, which, yeah, it's foreign missions in a sense, but it's dealing with expatriates is really a different thing altogether than, trying to start churches in a culture that is totally different from your own. What do you think, Carolyn? You've been down this path.
Yes, I have, and it was actually similar to your experience, something you can't prove. From the time I was probably 6 years old or so, I decided I was going to be a nurse.
Okay.
Everyone was surprised I never changed my mind. And here in this church, with the GA, RA, YWA training, I was exposed to missions. And I remember a lady named Hazel, who was from Appomattox, a single missionary nurse in Nigeria. And she came on a Sunday night and showed slides and talked about her ministry, Hazel Moon. She described work with people with Hansen's disease and washing their feet to try to get sores healed, that kind of thing. But I remember very clearly that night thinking, maybe God will want me to be a missionary nurse in Africa someday. And it was real enough that when the lessons were on Africa in GAs and YWAs, I always listened a little better than when they were on another part of the world. And of course that was years before that became a reality, but of course it had to be because I was that young.
Yeah.
But working at a GA camp some years later, after she had retired and come to care for her mother, I had the opportunity to see Hazel again and tell her that God had used her in that way,
Wow.
which was a real blessing.
Oh, yeah. Have you known personally missionaries overseas who didn't express a specific call to missions? They were just there because that's where they thought they needed to be?
Not that I met personally, no.
Okay. Which doesn't surprise me because the cost to a person to follow that path is so great at so many levels. It's hard for me to imagine somebody pursuing that without a really strong motivation. And I would argue a motivation that is founded in a sense that that's what God wants them to do.
Man, I think that, at least in the good old days, at the Foreign Mission Board, as it was, wouldn't let you get past that filter. If they ask you what is your call to be to this thing, and you said, "Well, I don't have a call. I just think it would be dandy to go," I think they'd say, "Can't do that."
Well, and a few weeks ago, I read an account of a career missionary who very nearly didn't get to go on that point. When they asked about his call to missions, he quoted Matthew 28:19-20, the Great Commission. And he really couldn't understand what they were looking for. To him, it was just, this is what Jesus said to do. I need to do it. And they finally relented and appointed him. And it's a good thing because he's proven to be one of the most effective, one of the greatest Southern Baptist missionaries of this era. I mean, we're talking about an amazing guy. You know who he is. I can't even reveal his real name. He goes by the pseudonym Nick Ripken in his publications because he's working in situations that are so dangerous that it would be a risk to him, his family, and the people he works with if his real name was published. I mean, we're talking about the missionary version of a Navy SEAL. And who's done the most important seminal research on the persecuted church that's ever been done in 2,000 years. Who's been in places that most of us couldn't even get to, interviewing Christians in all kinds of contexts of persecution. Truly amazing. And by his own testimony, he never had any special call to missions. He just had a call to obedience. So, in light of Nick Ripken and Carolyn, I'd have to say there are both avenues out there.
You're right, Jack, about the filters. I don't know if they still do this or not, but they, in interview process, intentionally ask very threatening, almost threatening, embarrassing questions. I think to see how you'll handle it in replying to them. See the manner in which you handle it.
And they'll get you up at a commissioning service. Everybody, all you 25 missionaries who are going, we want you to parade by here and tell us your call. And you're supposed to have it ready.
And at one point, at one point in my ministry, I was operating under a very specific sense of call to be involved in church planning, and I spent a good bit of my ministry doing that. That process began with a very clear sense that God was calling me to plant churches in Montana, which I have never done. So I had it half right. Yeah, you wanted me to plant churches. I think Montana was just a carrot he dangled out there to get me moving, because I wanted to live in Montana. I ended up in Chicago, which was never on my list of places I wanted to live.
Not much like Montana, is it?
No, about as far from Montana as you can get and stay in the U.S.
Montana wouldn't be high on the list, but Chicago even lower for sure.
But it's where I needed to be. Maybe not where I wanted to be.
That's right.
When you get beyond special cases like vocational ministry and missions into the broader world of just vocation and choosing a college and career paths, far fewer people would contend that there is a specific path that God has set for us that we have to find. Does God have a plan for your life? Absolutely. Does He know in advance where you're going? No question. Does He want you to pray about these decisions? Absolutely. Is there a perfect plan that He has set out that you have to discover with a sense of knowing this is what God wants me to do? There's no evidence for that. Not in Scripture. Now again, you may feel that in your bones, and after what I just said, I'm not going to argue the point. But I think again, when you talk about using wisdom, this is a place where a lot of wisdom needs to be applied. Some people have passions, gifts, aptitudes that they need to follow. I took a couple years of piano lessons. I still remember where middle C is, and that's about all I got out of it. I'm sure that had I been motivated and worked hard, I could have learned to be competent as a pianist. But when I look at my small hands with fingers that are all almost exactly the same length, I don't have the hands for a concert pianist. There were some chords I just couldn't quite reach. So if my heart and passion had been to play in Carnegie Hall, Chopin, I was probably setting myself up for disappointment because I don't have the mechanical hardware for that kind of piano playing. There's a lot of things I could do with these hands. They're great for woodworking. They're just not very great for piano playing. I probably could have become a proficient woodworker with the right tools and opportunity. I could have done what my dad did, which was an electrician. There was a day he offered to get me in the apprentice program at the plant. There had been days in ministry when I wish I'd taken him up on it. But making those vocational decisions requires wisdom. You really need, the better you know yourself, the better you know your circumstances, the better you know what are realistic opportunities, the better decisions you're going to make. Does that mean that you can't go beyond any place where your family's ever been? Well, obviously not. Again, I'm a living example of that. I'm the first member of my family to ever go to college, much less get a graduate degree. I demonstrated that it was possible for a land to get through college. My dad's got a high school diploma. My mom eventually got a GED. She got mad at the principal and quit when she was in high school. Went back years later and got it. That was fine for them. And it might well have been fine for me in some other direction, but to go into ministry, I needed more. Questions, comments, pushback, observations? He has a chapter on giving, which is in some ways a bit of a surprise in a book of this type. And he sums up his position on page 372. Old Testament tithing has been superseded by New Testament grace giving. The faith promise method of giving is unbiblical, though it correctly encourages prayer and generous giving. Grace giving is purposeful, proportionate giving as God has prospered you. Giving priorities are immediate family first, then relatives, local church, gospel outreach, relief of believers, relief of unbelievers. Now, in general, I'd say I'd agree with what he has to say here. There are a couple things I'd like to speak to. The idea that Old Testament tithing has been superseded by New Testament grace giving is accurate. But it's not a loophole for New Testament believers to say, well, I don't have to tithe, so I can, and give whatever I want. Sir?
Abraham tithed before the law.
Okay. Yes, he did. What the New Testament teaches is the opportunity and the freedom to give ultimately far more than a tithe. Give you a specific case in point. Most of you have heard of Rick Warren, pastor of Saddleback Church in Southern California. When Rick went out there, I actually met him shortly after he started that church when it was running about 300. And, everything that he owned fit in a little U-Haul trailer behind his car. So, he was a preacher's son, fresh out of seminary, like most fresh out of seminary people, he was barely, keeping the wolf away from the door. His work prospered in ways most of us couldn't imagine. He's got 20-something thousand people now coming to hear him preach every Sunday. When Rick wrote The Purpose-Driven Church, it was a bestseller. When he wrote The Purpose-Driven Life, it was a runaway bestseller. I mean, it sold millions of copies. And Rick became rich. I don't know what his salary was at Saddleback Church, but it wasn't the salary to make you rich. You know, he wasn't getting a percentage of the take, he was getting a salary. But when that book came, he had more money than he'd ever imagined. Well, he did a couple things. One, from his profits, he paid back to Saddleback Church every dollar that they had ever given him in salary in the 15, 20 years he had been there. He stopped taking a salary. And he and Kay began what he referred to as reverse tithing. They gave God 90% and they lived on 10%. I think I still have in my files an article, a review of that book that was published in the Wall Street Journal relating this and saying after reading the book you would have been disappointed if there'd been anything else. Now to me that is a marvelous example of grace giving. Had Rick been operating under the law, as was the case in Old Testament times, he might have been able to say, well, I gave my 10%, that's all is required, and God is pleased with that. But that wasn't enough under grace. This is one of those things that Joyce and I did, and I don't know if it was legalism or just a sense of duty or what all may have motivated it, but very, very early, from the very beginning of our life together, we've regarded that first 10% as God's and have tried consistently to give God his 10% first and then make wise decisions about what was left. There have been a few times it's been really hard because of personal circumstances. But it's and there have been times we've kind of gotten behind and worked hard to pay it back because that was something, was just a commitment we made to ourselves and to God. So I think that if we look at this as a legalistic obligation, then we're giving for the wrong reasons in the first place. And this whole business of seed money to God that is preached by some television preachers today, there's absolutely no biblical basis for that at all. You know, seed faith. You know, if you honor God by sending me $100 as evidence of your faith, and God is going to magnify that, and you're going to be financially blessed by your seed gift. There's not one shred of biblical evidence for that. It's and I won't go so far as to say that everybody that's preaching that is a snake oil salesman, but some of them are, definitely. And some of the better known ones on television are charlatans. And there's plenty of history. Sir?
What did Abraham do?
I'm sorry?
What did Abraham do when he got his first fruits?
Well, the only specific place that talks about Abraham and giving was when he came back after pursuing the kings of the east that had attacked Sodom, and out of the booty from that raid, he gave 10% to Melchizedek at the ancient city of Salem, which later became Jerusalem.
I mean, it's not a, it's the spirit of the word with the tithe.
But,
Because that was before the law.
yeah,
So out of his heart, Abraham gave a tenth to Melchizedek, one who was fashioned after Christ.
it was also, however, the only time that we have evidence in Abraham's life of him giving anything.
Right.
So you can draw some parallels there, but they're not absolute parallels.
Well, I mean, I'm just.
Yeah,
I-
yeah, you make a good point, and
from a-
it
from a
was.
heart- From a man whose
Yeah.
heart is after God,
Mhm.
it's not that I have to give a tenth. It's, I want to give a tenth because his word says, I'm a jealous God. Seek ye first my kingdom and all my righteousness, and all these other things will be added to you.
Yep.
Now, if I do that, does that mean that I'm gonna get everything on earth? No, it doesn't. But what I do is I trust in my God with that tenth for obedience, because he doesn't want sacrifice, he wants obedience. And the offering comes above and beyond that, whatever the person wants to do.
One of the more interesting tithing testimonies I'm personally familiar with is one from my old friend Bob Yarbrough, who some of you met at my installation service. I should say Professor Dr. Robert Yarbrough now, but he'll always be Bob to me. Shortly after he and Bernie were married, they went off to Montana, where he was initially planning to go into forestry, and ended up logging and putting his wife through nursing school at St. Mary's Nursing School in Missoula, Montana. When they first got married, Bob, out of a sense of his training in Sunday school and vacation Bible school and whatnot, just assumed that they would tithe. And so he insisted that they tithe out of his paycheck and out of hers. She was less than thrilled about the idea. She wasn't yet persuaded that this was a good idea, but she relented. Even though what she really wanted to do was get a television set, which I have no doubt that Bob could have gone his entire life and never had a TV and never missed it. But Bernie wanted the TV. And so they started tithing, and within a very short time they joined Trinity Baptist Church in Missoula and got to know the pastor, whose hobby was fixing up old TVs. And he gave the Yarbroughs one. And I don't know that God wanted the Yarbroughs to have a TV, but he wanted to teach Bernie something about, that obedience is recognized and blessed. And so the Yarbroughs got a television. Again, if it had been up to Bob, it'd probably still be the only TV they ever had, but somewhere along the way, Bernie insisted on an upgrade. Okay,
Hey, excuse me, folks. I'm from out of town, I'm from Florida. I am trying to get to Salem, Virginia, to the VA hospital. Is there any way y'all can bless a veteran with a couple dollars to get on the Greyhound bus in a couple hours? I'm trying to spend $18 to go on this bus to get to the VA hospital in Salem. I got no ID on me, I'm coming from Florida, out of money here, I just walked up
how are you going to get into the VA hospital without any ID?
because they had me there, that's my record. I'm from Roanoke, they have my record there. When I get there, I will be all right. But until I get there, I'm not gonna be all right. Don't mean to interrupt y'all's Bible study, love it. But I was just walking by here and I thought, hey, maybe some of my brothers in Christ, sisters in Christ will help me out.
Okay, well, we need to finish here, and we'll talk later here, but we're close to the end of our hour here. Just sort of summing up our study here. Friesen's wisdom approach to decision making, as I said at the beginning of this study, tends to cause people to react in one of two ways. One is relief, and the other is threatened, intimidated. It is a relief when you think that there is not some some little dot in the center of the bullseye, the perfect will of God that you're on a lifelong quest to try to find. I think he does a pretty good job of demonstrating that that really isn't a biblical model for decision making. People are sometimes greatly relieved to realize that I've got this area of freedom in which I can operate so long as I am obedient to God's moral will and recognize and submit to the fact that he is sovereign and that his will is going to be accomplished ultimately. That when I am operating in that area of freedom, I don't have to agonize over this. I apply principles of wise decision making and can relax in knowing that, like a loving father who's given me several different options, God has given me the freedom to make good choices within the confines of his moral will. That's one response. I've heard from some in this study that that's how they responded. It was a relief. The other is anxiety for one of a couple different reasons. One is the sudden realization that I am responsible before God for making good choices. And I'd much rather push that off on him. With making decisions comes responsibility. I have to go to the work and effort to use wisdom in how I make decisions. I have to be responsible before God to regularly study his word and understand its principles so that I can apply them to decision making. There is responsibility, there is accountability. And if you're the type of person who likes to push off responsibility to somebody else, this can be anxiety producing. There is another kind of response that is less than thrilled, I guess. That is the feeling that somehow this wisdom course for decision making minimizes the importance of prayer or minimizes God's involvement in my daily life. I would argue that that conclusion is based on a misreading or misunderstanding of what Gary is trying to teach. He is not saying that God does not have a perfect plan for your life. Under his sovereignty, he does. What he is saying is that you don't have the onus on you to figure that out in detail ahead of time. That your responsibility is to operate within his moral will, to be submissive to his sovereign will, to be open to his special revelation if he chooses to so bless you, to be responsible to use wisdom when you're operating in that area of freedom, and to rest in the knowledge that he loves you, that he watches over you, that he cares for you, that he wants the best for you, and that he hears and answers your prayers. And I would argue that a careful reading of this book in no way jeopardizes any of that. I have pointed out the special cases where I am inconsistent with Dr. Friesen, and I have no problem with that inconsistency. But again, I cannot give you a compelling proof for my inconsistency. I can't say, I think Gary Friesen is wrong about this, and here is my biblical proof text for it. I have to resort to the very thing that he is inclined to dismiss, which is my feelings. And that's just too bad, Gary.